joining us now is Jenn Stanley. She's a journalist, a writer, and an audio producer. She lives in Chicago, Illinois. She's the senior staff reporter for Rewire, which was formerly RH Reality Check. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Salon, all sorts of other publications, and she is the producer and host of Rewire's new storytelling podcast, Choiceless, which delivers personal stories about reproductive injustice and the laws that put people in choiceless situations. Jenn, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, let's start with this. Now, Rewire used to be called RH Reality Check. You guys changed your name, I think, a few months back, right?
Yep, March, we had the rebrand.
So why was that?
Well, a few things. RH Reality Check is just kind of a mouthful to say. Mm-hmm. So when you're saying it to somebody, or you work for RH Reality Check, or, there was this great story on RH Reality Check, people are like, RH, what? What are the... And then you explain reproductive health. And we also do a lot of other content under the general umbrella of reproductive justice. So we've been reporting a lot on race injustice and basically any issue in which that's about bringing babies into the world, or the right to choose when to have a family and bring babies into the world. So our focus is definitely on reproductive rights and abortion, but also the huge umbrella of reproductive justice. So that was a big part of the rebrand, and wanting to be able to incorporate kind of all that we do and make it just an easier, simple name for what I think is just an easier, simple site to navigate. The new site is beautiful, and I think the name matches that.
The name is actually great. It's a really good name. I'm a fan of good names. And what is the website, just so we get that out there?
The website is rewire.news, so okay. NEWS.
Oh, I didn't even know you could do news now. That opens up a universe of new possibilities. And the main reason we wanted to have you on the show, Jenn, was because of the Choiceless podcast. I briefly summarized, but give us your sense of what it is.
Choiceless is a storytelling podcast, meaning that we have a storyteller on the podcast telling their personal narrative. So it's not just a Q&A. It's really a narrative with a beginning, middle, and an end, and their feelings about their story. And the focus is really on them and the storyteller. And I work as the host basically just to introduce them and then to clarify any issues that they ran into with the laws, to explain some legislation that was passed that may have affected their ability to access care, that may have affected their story. So it's really about them, and that's what we want to focus on.
So when you talk about legislation that might have affected their reproductive experience, for lack of a better term, are you talking about legislation that might have hurt and legislation that might have helped? Or mostly about the barriers that are being constructed nowadays?
It's a lot about the barriers, because that is, unfortunately, the world that we live in now. But some of it is about the positive end of that. We had one storyteller, Regina, who had to make the very difficult decision to terminate a pregnancy at 27 weeks, which is past the point at which most physicians would agree that a fetus would be viable outside the womb. And that is a pregnancy, that's a termination that could be very difficult in other places and other situations, but she was able to make that decision. And part of how I was drawn to her story, how I first heard it, was that she was speaking out against the restrictive laws in Wisconsin, where she now lives, that would make it incredibly difficult for her to have accessed the care that she really needed. I mean, it was her circumstances were very heartbreaking and very extenuating.
So I guess, there are certain people out there. I'm thinking specifically of men, and I'm thinking specifically of conservative men, as I don't want to generalize, but they might say, if you ran into one of them at a, family event or whatever, they might say, well, how many stories can there be? I mean, isn't it going to get repetitious pretty quickly? And I mean, I don't believe that's the case, but what would you say to somebody like that?
Oh, I mean, I can see where you would think that, and then you just need to listen to the stories, because what's amazing is how different, even stories that on paper could sound very similar. The point of why to me it was so important to do this podcast and to focus on reproductive justice is that the stories are so different and they're so numerous. I mean, we're not just focusing on abortion specifically, but that's a big part of the stories we do, are people telling stories about terminating their pregnancies. But 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime. These stories are numerous, and each of the stories is very unique. And I think when people begin to listen to these stories and pay attention, we can make even the most, my hope is that we can make the most conservative, narrow-minded people, I don't mean those to be the same, but I'm just saying somebody who would say, aren't those stories all the same? And isn't this not that important? We want to make those people realize that the stories are numerous, and we're taking back those stories. And I want to give back those stories to the storyteller instead of having the wider, this political system that is shutting down, and this anti-choice movement that is shutting down the ability for people to be honest about the experience and the unique experience that they're having.
Right. I think you touch on 2 great points. We're talking with Jenn Stanley, the producer of Choiceless, podcast about women's reproductive experiences in the context of our current society and laws. I mean, I think you touch on a couple great points. One is so much of the dialogue about what goes on with women's bodies is not even being conducted by women, much less women who have experienced this process. So, I mean, the extreme example of that was a sort of obscene sight of, I guess it was the Virginia legislature, among others, of rich white men debating whether to use transvaginal sound probes on women. Very, very invasive conversation, much less invasive procedure. So it's the kind of the taking back, I would assume that's part of it. But you also raise the notion of the societal stigma that people are trying, I think at this point consciously. I mean, in the 1960s, okay, it was illegal, there was a stigma associated with abortion and so on. I think now it's consciously, there's a culture war being fought from the right to attach and maintain a stigma against it. And I think part of what you're saying is, this is a way to combat that. Is that correct? Am I interpreting you correctly? Or
That's exactly right. The anti-choice rhetoric is very effective in keeping the shame and stigma surrounding reproductive rights alive. And I want to be clear too that it's not just about the right to have an abortion. It's everything surrounding sexuality and being a woman or any person and having to deal with these issues. We don't talk about miscarriage. A lot of women and pregnant people, they suffer through miscarriage and abortion and the stigma attached to that alone without talking about it. And when they begin to share their stories, they realize, they maybe had a neighbor or a sister or a best friend who went through the same thing and also felt silent or felt shamed and was silent because of that shame. And until we start to feel more comfortable sharing these stories, the anti-choice movement will continue to be successful in creating these lies and this shame and this stigma. As long as we stay silent, that stigma will stay alive.
And there's a tremendous pain associated with being stigmatized, and a tremendous, I think, for anybody, a tremendous relief in being able to pierce the stigma and tell your story. And so I think in that sense, what you're doing is very powerful. Tell me a little bit, Jenn, about the process. How do you identify your storytellers, your guests, and do you work with them on crafting their story and that sort of thing?
I found stories through a variety of places, and just doing the work that I do. I've been covering these issues for several years now. People want to come forward. And so it's kind of amazing. Some activist organizations will be able to help identify people, but more often than not, it's kind of in places that you wouldn't even expect. It's through word of mouth. It's just from being out there. It's just from being in this world and people saying, yeah, I want to share my story. I identify stories by making sure people understand that it's not a Q&A, that they really need to have a story. And I try to make sure that people have enough distance from their story that they'll be able to reflect on it, because I think the moment of reflection is one of the most powerful parts of this kind of storytelling, is being able to say, this happened and this happened and this happened, and here's how I feel about it. That moment, I think, is what really reaches people and will reach people across the aisle. So how I help people shape their stories is that I make sure ahead of time that there is a story. And then when we're in the interview, that's where I help people shape the story. So they might, do an overview, and then we really unpack certain things. We make sure that people understand that it's for audio, which I think if people aren't used to doing these kind of interviews, they might not be used to kind of painting a picture with their words and really describing in a way that other people can picture the experience. So that's a way in which I help. And then it's really their story. I produce the interviews after. We cut a lot out, obviously, because they're about 2 hour to 2 hour long interviews that are cut down to about 20 to 30 minutes. So we definitely cut a lot of it out, and that helps shape it and make it more concise and friendly to the ear.
And how many stories have you told so far?
We have 4 that have already aired. The 5th one airs this Tuesday. And then this first season will be 9 stories, and then we'll take a little hiatus and start up again with a season 2. We just don't have a date yet, but we've had a great listener response, and a great response from storytellers who want to tell their stories. So there's definitely no shortage of great stories out there.
So, you mentioned a couple times, Jenn Stanley, getting to people across the aisle, which I think is, or, people on the fence, whatever, which I think is really important, because I think that, empathy is a natural human emotion. And I think that when people hear the stories, when it's changed from an abstraction to a human story, people understand the implications of their own position. But how do you get these stories to people who might not, at least as far as they know, be sympathetic or agree with the position that, for example, Rewire might take?
That's a great question, and something that I think about all the time when I'm producing these stories. So Rewire definitely has a strong audience already, and a lot of our audience are already aware of the issues that we're presenting and the issues that we cover. With multimedia and with the work that I do in Choiceless in particular, I want these stories to be engaging and present new information, and be interesting to our already existing audience base and to the people who are very loyal Rewire readers. We want to give them more content, but we also hope, and I hope, that this can be a bridge to bring people who maybe don't know a lot about our issue, or maybe feel on the fence about our issues, to bring them to the website to get a more deeper understanding. So this is kind of like the gateway drug to more information in some ways. And I think part of that has to do with the way the human mind makes decisions about their positions on issues like this. We know that the public opinion hasn't changed very much on abortion since Roe v. Wade in 1973. But part of that is that the way that we question, in the way that the polls work, the way that these questions work, they almost trick people out of being able to make good decisions about how they feel on these issues, because we aren't presenting the reality that most people go through. And so it's easy to say, okay, I guess I don't think abortion should be illegal in all circumstances, but I don't think it should be used as birth control, or used
Right.
it shouldn't be available to everybody, or we should have some restrictions. All of these things are actually very it's very poisonous to start using that kind of rhetoric, and it speaks to the success of the anti-choice movement, that this rhetoric just gets fed into people who would consider themselves moderate or even consider themselves liberal. And so I think to be able to say, okay, well, here's a real story. Here is somebody's actual narrative. I think that is going to reach the more moderate person to then come to our website and learn more about the issue. So I think, to sum up the questions, the podcast is meant to as a gateway into our world and our issues in a bigger sense. And I think that will be successful, and it has been, I think.
Well, okay. That's great. That sounds great. Where do people go to find it?
You can find us on iTunes, which is another thing. So we're hoping to because you can find us outside of the website, you can find us on the website at rewire.news/choiceless, but you can also find us on iTunes. So I'm hoping that as we get more visibility on iTunes, we've already been featured under new and noteworthy podcasts under our category of personal diaries, personal journals, and personal stories. So people can definitely find us on iTunes and anywhere you can download a podcast.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Jenn Stanley, producer and host of Choiceless and journalist and writer for Rewire, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.